On the morning she was to marry the coldest man in England, no carriage came for Eleanor Wren but a plain one, and no driver but a silent man in a worn gray coat who would not meet her eyes. She did not know, she could not have known, that the man holding the reins was the very Duke she was riding the last hour through the frost to wed. She did not know that every word she spoke on that road, every truth she let slip because she believed herself alone with a servant, was being weighed by the only person in the world it could ruin her to be honest in front of. She knew only that her brother was dying, that the contract was signed, and that a woman with nothing left to sell had already sold the last thing she owned. The year was 1818, the 14th of October, and by the time the chapel bell rang noon, the Duke of Hartmoor would do the one thing no one in 3 counties believed him capable of, and Eleanor Wren would have to decide, in front of every staring face, whether she still meant to say yes. What neither of them yet knew was that the saying of it would be the easy part, and that the people who needed their marriage to be loveless and childless were already gathering in the cold chapel, smiling, with knives behind their teeth. Renfield had been a good house once. Eleanor could remember it, faintly, the way one remembers the warmth of a fire long after the room has gone cold, the long table laid for company, the orchard heavy in autumn, her mother laughing at something her father had said across the candlelight. That had been before the bank, before the bad harvests, before the cough took root in her brother's chest and would not be persuaded to leave. Now the orchard was sold. The long table had 3 good chairs left and 4 that were mended. And the cough was the clock by which the whole house told its time. Eleanor was 24, and she had been the practical one for as long as practicality had been required of her, which was to say since she was 16, and her mother had taken to her bed for the last time. She knew which floorboards complained and which stayed silent. She knew how many candles remained in the press and how long they must last. She knew, to the shilling, the precise distance between what the Wrens owed and what the Wrens had, and she had known for some months now that the distance could not be walked. It could only be married across. Her beauty, like the house, was of the quiet, unfashionable sort. Where other young women were all color and brightness, Eleanor was the brown of turned earth and the gray-green of a winter sea. Her gowns had been her mother's, taken in by her own hand. She had stopped, some years ago, minding the difference. "It is a great deal of money," her brother said. Henry was 16 and ought to have been out breaking his neck on horseback and falling in love with unsuitable girls. Instead, he lay propped against the bolster in the warmest room of the house, which was not very warm, with a blanket across his knees and his father's old books stacked within reach. He was clever and gentle and far too perceptive for Eleanor's comfort. "It is enough money," Eleanor said, "for a physician from London, a real one, sea air, if the man advises it, whatever you need, for as long as you need it. And in exchange, you marry a man you have never met. Women have married for less and called it love." She tucked the blanket closer, though it did not need tucking. "I am not being sold, Henry, whatever the village says. I am making a choice. It happens to be the first useful one anyone has offered me." Henry studied her with their mother's eyes. "They say he is cruel. They say he is cold," Eleanor corrected. "There is a difference. Cold men are merely men who have decided not to be hurt again. I can live beside a cold man. I have lived beside worse." She meant the bailiffs, the whispering, the long humiliation of watching a name turn to a byword. "He will have his heir in time and his peace, and I shall have a roof that does not leak and a brother who is well. That is a fair bargain in any ledger." What she did not say, what she did not let herself say even in the privacy of her own thoughts, was that she was frightened, not of cruelty. She had taken the measure of her own courage years ago and found it sufficient for most things. She was frightened of being, for the rest of her life, a piece of furniture in a great cold house, useful, unremarked, and entirely unseen. It was her father who found her later, in the cold parlor, where her wedding clothes were laid over the back of the good sofa. Sir Mortimer Wren had once been a broad, laughing man. Debt had folded him in on himself like a letter read too many times. He stood in the doorway turning his hat in his hands, as though he had come to call on a stranger in his own house. "Eleanor," he said, "you need not do this. I will find another way." There was no other way. They both knew it. There had not been another way for 2 years, and the knowing of it was the thing that had bent him. "There is no shame in it, Papa," she said gently, because she could not bear the way he could no longer meet her eye. "You did not gamble us into this. The weather did, And the bank did. And Henry's lungs did. You have only loved us badly with money you did not have, which is the kindest fault a man can own. She crossed and straightened his collar, the way her mother used to. Let me do the one thing I can do well. Let me be useful. It is all I have ever wanted, to matter to someone for what I can carry. Her father's eyes were wet. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would not cost them both too much, and he pressed her hand once, hard, and went out. The Duke of Hartmoor was a name spoken in the village the way one speaks of weather that might turn dangerous. Julian Ashcroft, vast lands to the north, a fortune that had outlived 3 kings, and a reputation, carefully tended, for wanting nothing and no one. He had married once, it was said, a great beauty, Lady Cassandra, who had wanted his title and not him, and who had died of a fever after 3 winters of a marriage so cold the servants warmed their hands at other fires. He had not been seen in society since. He did his own accounts. He refused every invitation. The matchmaking mothers of the North had given him up as a bad business. And then his man of business had written to Sir Mortimer Wren, of all the ruined gentlemen in England, with an offer so plain it was almost an insult. The daughter's hand, the family's debts, a settlement that would keep them all. No courtship, no meeting. A signature, a date, a chapel. Eleanor had read the letter twice and signed it once, and she had added, in her own clear hand, a single condition that had nothing to do with herself, but that comes later, and it matters more than she could have guessed. You will write to me, Henry said, when she went up to say goodnight. Every week, she promised, and you will be too busy being thoroughly examined by expensive London men to read half of it. He smiled, and the smile turned into the cough, and Eleanor held the basin and rubbed his back and did not let her face do anything at all until it had passed. When he was settled again, pale and spent against the pillow, he caught her wrist with a hand that had once thrown a cricket ball clean over the orchard wall, and now weighed almost nothing. If he is unkind to you, Henry said, I shall get well, purely so that I may come north and be a great nuisance to him. I am counting on it, Eleanor said. She set out the next morning before light, in a hired post-chaise paid for out of the settlement's first advance, and traveled 2 days north into colder and colder country, and lodged the last night at a low coaching inn called the Hart's Head, that stood, she was told, almost within sight of the Hartmoor gates. She slept badly in a strange bed with the sign creaking in the wind, and rose before dawn, and put on the dove-gray gown, the only new thing she had owned in 4 years, plain and well cut, with long sleeves and a high neck. She had asked for gray. The seamstress had thought it strange. Eleanor thought of it as the color of survival, and she had survived a great deal in it. A carriage was to come at 10 to carry her the last hour to the chapel. She waited in the inn parlor with her small bag on her knees, 2 handkerchiefs, her mother's prayer book, and a pressed sprig of rosemary from the Renfield garden, for remembrance. And she watched the road, and she did not let herself be afraid. A half-mile off, in a house too large to ever be warm, Julian Ashcroft had stood at a window through the whole of that gray hour before dawn, and looked at a letter he had read more times than he would admit. It was from her, the only one she had sent that had not gone through the lawyers. A short, plain note, no perfume, no flourishes, returning a question his man of business had put to her about the settlement. I require nothing for myself, she had written, in a clear, unhurried hand. Direct the whole of it toward my brother's care, and let that be set down in the contract so that it cannot be undone. I will sign whatever insures it, nothing for herself. Julian had read those words, and felt the old, well-worn cynicism rise to meet them, because he had learned the hard way what such words were worth. Cassandra had said a great many beautiful things in a great many beautiful letters. She had wanted, it turned out, a coronet and a London house and the particular pleasure of being envied. And when she discovered the man beneath the title was only a man, tired, careful, already fighting to save an estate his father had nearly drowned, she had set about punishing him for the disappointment with a thoroughness that still woke him some nights. He had built a fortress after that, stone by stone. He did his own accounts so that no one could rob him. He refused every invitation so that no one could measure him. He had decided, with the cold clarity of a man cauterizing a wound, that he would never again hand his happiness to another person, and wait, like a fool, to see what they did with it. And now he was to marry a stranger, a ruined baronet's daughter with a dying brother, and, according to every cynical instinct he possessed, every reason on earth to be precisely the kind of grasping, performing woman he had sworn off forever. Nothing for herself. It was either the truest thing he had read in years, or the most cunning. He could not tell which. And he had sworn, the day his first marriage ended, that he would never again walk blind into a bargain that could cost him everything. So he would not. "Finch," he said. The butler materialized from the shadows by the door, as butlers do. Mr. Finch had served the house since Julian's father's time, and there was very little left in the world capable of surprising him. "Your Grace, the carriage that is to bring Miss Wren from the Hart's Head this morning. Who drives it?" "Crane, Your Grace, as always." "Crane is unwell," Julian said. Finch's eyes flickered. "Is he, Your Grace?" "He will be, within the hour. A chill. Nothing dangerous. He will keep to his room, with my compliments, and a bottle of the good brandy, and he will tell no one." Julian turned from the window. "I will drive the carriage from the Hart's Head myself, in his coat. I will be announced to no one. Miss Wren has never seen my face, and there is no portrait of me she could have seen. I have sat for none since my father died. She will believe she rides with a servant." For a long moment Finch said nothing. Then, with the particular care of a man who has earned the right to a small impertinence, "May I ask to what end, Your Grace?" "To the end of knowing what I marry," Julian said. "Before I marry it. A woman shows a duke what she wishes him to see. She shows a coachman the truth, because a coachman does not signify." He picked up his gloves. "An hour on the road, Finch. 1 hour of honesty before a lifetime of performance. I think I have earned an hour. And if what you hear displeases you—" Julian's jaw set. "Then I will have learned it for the price of a cold morning, instead of the price of my whole life." Finch inclined his head the precise fraction that decades of service had taught him meant, "I think this unwise, and I will do it anyway." "Very good, Your Grace. I shall see to Crane's unfortunate chill." He moved to the door, then paused, as he always did when he intended to leave a thought behind him. "Your father once told me, Your Grace, that a man learns most about another person not from what they say when they are watched, but from what they do when they believe no one is keeping the account." He let that settle. "I only observe that the road runs both ways. She will not be the only one unobserved this morning. You may hear something you have spent 4 years arranging not to hear." Julian did not answer. But he thought about it long after the butler had gone, standing at the window with his father's cracked pocket watch warming in his closed hand. The watch that had stopped at 20 minutes past 4, the hour the old Duke died, and that Julian had never been able to bring himself either to mend or to put away. He carried it everywhere, and looked at it never. It was, he had told himself, merely a habit. It was not a habit. It was a wound he kept in his pocket so that he would not have to keep it in the open, where someone might see it and, seeing it, come close. He put on Crane's worn gray coat. It smelled of horses and tallow and other men's weather. He pulled the plain hat low, and the 6th Duke of Hartmoor went down the back stairs of his own house like a thief, and out to the stable, and took up the reins himself for the first time in 15 years. The carriage that came for Eleanor was plain, serviceable, and a little shabby, and she was glad of it. A grand one would have made the whole business feel like a pantomime. This felt like what it was, a working conveyance, sent to fetch a working sort of bride. The driver did not come down to hand her in. He sat hunched on the box in the worn gray coat with the collar turned up and the hat pulled low against the cold, and he touched the brim of it without quite looking at her, and said, in a low, rough voice, "Miss Wren." "Thank you," she said, and climbed in herself, arranging her gray skirts and her small bag on her knees. The door shut. The carriage swayed forward. The last hour began. The road north of the Hart's Head ran up through frost-stiffened country, the hedges silvered, the woods gone to rust and gold, the sky the flat pale gray of a coin. Eleanor watched it pass and felt the strange floating calm that comes when a thing has been dreaded so long that its arrival is almost a relief. After a quarter of an hour she found she could not bear the silence, which was the kind of silence that has a person at the center of it. "You are in the Duke's service?" she asked the back of the gray coat. A pause. "I am." "Then you will know him better than I do. I have never set eyes on the man I am to marry within the hour." She heard the small, dry note in her own voice, and did not regret it. "You may tell me the worst. I would rather meet it on the road than at the altar." The coat was silent so long she thought he would not answer. Then, "What have you been told?" "That he is cold," Eleanor said. "That he wants nothing and no one. That he buried a wife who did not love him, and has not forgiven the living for it since." She tilted her head. Is it true? Another pause. Longer. The last part, the coachman said at last, maybe nearer the mark than the rest. It was, Eleanor thought, an oddly careful answer for a servant. But the cold had a way of making everyone careful, and she let it pass. Well, she said, I did not agree to marry him for warmth. I have a brother who is dying for want of a physician we cannot afford, and the Duke of Hartmoor can afford a great many physicians, and in exchange he wants an heir and to be left in peace. It is an honest enough trade. I only hope he is not a liar. I can endure cold. I have a great deal of practice. I cannot endure being deceived. The carriage went over a rut. The gray coat steadied without comment. Most women, the coachman said, in your position, would speak of the title, the carriages, the jewels. Most women in my position have not spent 4 years selling the furniture, Eleanor said. We sold my mother's pearls in the 2nd year. I cried over them, which was foolish, because they bought 8 months of physicians for Henry, and a roof over the winter, and a string of beads never did that. I learned a great deal from those pearls. She looked out at the rushing hedges. Jewels do not keep. I have learned to value things that keep. A roof, a kind word when it can be got. A man who means what he says. I shall not pretend I would not like to be happy. I am not a saint, whatever the village decided when I stopped going to the assemblies, only that I have stopped expecting it, and stopped expecting it turns out to be a great freedom. You ask very little of the world, and now and then it surprises you. And if it does not surprise you, the coachman asked, if he is everything they say, cold to the bone, and silent, and shut. Eleanor considered it honestly, because it was an honest question, and she had asked it of herself on 2 long nights already. Then I shall make a life out of the corners of his, she said. I am good at corners. I have lived in the corners of other people's lives a long while. The useful daughter, the steady sister, the one who knows where the spare key is kept. I had thought, once, that I should like to be the middle of someone's life, instead of the edge of it. A small, rueful breath. But a person can be content in a corner, if the house is sound and there is work to do, and no one is unkind. I do not require to be adored. I require only not to be lied to, and not to be made small on purpose. The first I can hope for. The second I will not abide, Duke or no Duke. She did not know why she was saying so much to a stranger on a box. Perhaps because he was a stranger, and would forget her by nightfall, and there was no one at Renfield she could say these things to without frightening them. Perhaps because the alternative was the silence, and the silence had her brother's cough in it. Tell me of him, she said. Something true, not the village's tales. You who drive his carriage and clean his boots. Is there anything in the man to like? The coachman was quiet for the length of a curve in the road. When he spoke, his voice had changed, though Eleanor could not have said how. He pays his people fairly, he said slowly, and on time, which is rarer than it should be. He does not raise his hand or his voice. When the mill flooded 2 winters past, and the men could not work, he kept their wages full, and told no one, because he did not wish to be thanked for it. A man who is thanked, he thinks, has been bought, and owes something back. A pause. He is not a warm man. I will not lie to you and say he is. He had the warmth frightened out of him young, and then a marriage finished the work. But I have served warmer men who were a great deal worse. There is a difference between a man with no heart and a man who has put his somewhere safe and forgotten the way back to it. Eleanor turned from the window and looked at the gray back with new attention. That, she said softly, is a very thoughtful thing for a coachman to say. The collar of the gray coat went up another half-inch. A man has time to think, he said, on a long road. And has he forgotten the way back, she asked. Your Duke. To wherever he has put his heart. I believe, the coachman said. After a moment, he had stopped looking for it. A man stops looking for a thing he is certain is gone. It is less painful than searching and not finding. Then I am sorry for him, Eleanor said simply. Truly, it is a colder thing to stop looking than to grieve. Grief at least believes the thing was real. The horse's hooves rang on the frozen road. The coachman said nothing for a long while, and when Eleanor glanced up, she saw that his hands on the reins had gone still and white at the knuckle, as though he were holding very hard to something that was not the leather at all. And because she had begun, and because some knot in her chest had loosened, she went on. About Henry, and the books he loved, and the cricket ball he had thrown clean over the orchard wall the summer before the cough came, and how he had whooped and her father had laughed his old broad laugh, and her mother had clapped from the window, and how she kept that one bright afternoon folded up small inside her like a pressed flower, to take out on the bad nights. She spoke of her mother's pearls, and her father's bent shoulders, and the particular shame of a name that had become a thing people lowered their voices to say in shops. She did not weep. She had taught herself years ago that weeping was a luxury that solved nothing. She simply spoke, plainly and without self-pity, as the frost burned off the fields and the towers of a great grey house rose at last above the bare trees. And on the box, the Duke of Hartmoor drove his own horses and listened to the truest hour of conversation he had heard in a decade, and felt something in the carefully buried center of him crack along a fault line he had believed long since sealed. For she had not performed, not once. She had not known there was anyone to perform for. She had spoken of his fairness when she believed it could win her nothing, and of her own fear when it could only cost her, and of her brother with a love so plain and unornamented that it shamed every pretty speech he had ever been given by a beautiful mouth. Nothing for herself. He had wondered which it was, the truest thing or the most cunning. He knew now, and the knowing was not the cool satisfaction of a suspicion confirmed. It was something far more frightening. It was hope, which he had buried deepest of all, sitting up in its grave. They were perhaps a mile from the gates when it happened. The near horse threw a shoe on a stretch of frost-rutted road, and the carriage lurched and slewed, and Eleanor was thrown hard against the door. The coachman had the team under command in an instant, a low word, a sure hand on the reins. But the carriage came to rest at an angle. One wheel dropped into the frozen ditch, and it was plain they would go no further until the horse was seen to. He came down from the box then. For the first time Eleanor saw him at his full height, and she thought, with the small distant part of her mind that noticed such things, that he was a great deal taller and a great deal younger than a coachman had any business being, and that his hands, when he opened the door to her, were not the hands of a man who spent his days with the reins. They were clean, and the nails were kept, and there was an old signet pale band of skin on one finger, where a ring was usually worn. "You are hurt," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am jolted," Eleanor said. "There is a difference. See to the horse." He did not move at once. He was looking at her, really looking. The gray eyes under the low hat, steady and dark, and far too direct for a servant's. There was something in his face she could not read, something that was almost like pain and almost like wonder, and entirely unlike anything she had expected to find on the road that morning. Then he turned to the horse. Eleanor climbed down without waiting to be helped, because she had never in her life waited to be helped when there was a thing to be done, and she went to the animal's head and laid her hand on its neck and spoke to it low and steady, while the coachman lifted the hoof and swore softly under his breath at the lost shoe. "There is a smith at the village we passed," she said, "half a mile back. The mare can walk it lame if we lead her slow and keep to the soft verge." He glanced up at her. "You know horses. I know a great many things a lady is not supposed to know. It is what happens when there is no one left to do them for you, and no money to pay a man who would." She stroked the mare's nose. "We shall both of us be late to a wedding. I expect the Duke will not be kept waiting often." "No," the coachman agreed gravely. "He will not." It was while he was loosing the harness, his coat pulled tight against the wind, that the watch fell. It slipped from some inner pocket and dropped into the frozen grass at the verge, a gentleman's pocket watch. Gold, old, the case worn smooth with handling, and cracked clean across the face. Eleanor stooped and picked it up before he could, and turned it in her cold fingers, and saw that the hands had stopped at 20 minutes past 4. "It is broken," she said. He went very still. "It is. A fine thing. For a coachman." She said it lightly, but she was watching his face, and his face had closed like a door against weather. "It was given to me," he said, "by a man who is dead. It stopped at the hour he died. I have never had it mended." He held out his hand for it, and there was something in the gesture that was not a servant asking for his property, but a man asking for the return of a wound. Eleanor did not give it back at once. She looked at the stopped hands, and at the cracked face, and at the man whose whole careful stillness had gone brittle over a broken watch, and she understood something about him that she could not have put into words. "You should mend it," she said gently, "not to forget the hour, only so that it may keep time again. The dead do not want us to stop, I think. My mother used to say grief is a clock we are afraid to wind, for fear that winding it means we have agreed to go on without them." She placed the watch carefully in his open palm, and for the briefest moment her cold fingers rested against his, and neither of them moved. But going on is not the same as forgetting. You may carry a man with you and still let the watch run. He would rather be carried, I think, than stopped. The coachman looked down at the watch in his hand as though he had never seen it before. When he looked up, his eyes were not a servant's eyes at all. "Who taught you to say a thing like that?" he said, very low, to a stranger on a road. "No one," Eleanor said. "I only know what it is to be afraid to wind the clock. I have a clock of my own I am frightened of. Come." The smith. "We are very late, and I find, to my own great surprise, that I have stopped dreading it." They led the lame mare back along the frost-bright road together, the gentleman in the gray coat and the woman in dove gray, and the smith was a good-natured man who shod the mare for a coin and a jest, and they led her home again, and they did not speak much, and the silence between them this time was not the kind that had a person at the center of it. It was the kind two people share when something has passed between them that neither is ready to name, and the Duke of Hartmoor, walking a borrowed mile beside the woman he had meant to interrogate from behind a disguise, found that the watch in his pocket had grown heavier and warmer than it had been in years, as though some stopped thing in him had been wound a single turn and had not yet decided whether it dared to tick. While a duke shod a horse in a country lane, his relations were gathering in the chapel at Hartmoor, and were not at all pleased to be kept waiting. Lady Augusta Vane was Julian's aunt by marriage, the widow of his late father's younger brother, a handsome, overdressed woman of 60, with a voice like a closing drawer, and a smile she put on and took off like a glove. She had spent the better part of 14 months in a quiet fury that her nephew intended to marry at all. For the arithmetic of it was very simple, and Lady Augusta had always been good at the arithmetic that favored her. If Julian died without a son, and reclusive, embittered men so conveniently did die without sons, the dukedom and every acre and shilling of it would pass to her own boy. Her boy stood beside her now, Mr. Percival Vane, a soft, smiling, faintly damp young man of 30, who had already, in his own mind, spent the Hartmoor fortune several times over, on horses he could not ride, and tables he could not leave, and a tailor he could not pay. He had been told his part and had practiced it in the glass. A baronet's daughter, Lady Augusta was saying, low and venomous, to the small knot of county people she had been at pains to invite, the very people whose tongues wagged loudest over the best tea-tables in the north, from some damp ruin in the south. No fortune, no family worth the name, a father drowning in debt to his chin. One asks oneself what hold the creature can possibly have over him. She let the question hang, elegant and poisonous. One does not like to say it aloud, but desperate women are capable of a great deal, and my poor nephew is a recluse, and recluses are so very easily worked upon. He was caught once, you know, by a beautiful face that wanted only his name. Now it seems he is to be caught by a plain one that wants only his money. One does grieve for him. "Quite," murmured Percival, who had been instructed in his part. "Quite. A schemer, one fears. A fortune huntress of the very lowest." "We shall see," his mother said, with a small pat to his sleeve that meant, "Be quiet, you are overdoing it. We shall watch her very closely, this Miss Wren. A woman who marries for money cannot help but show it, if one knows precisely where to look, at the silver, at the chandeliers, at the size of the rooms. And when she shows it, dear Julian, who has been deceived by a grasping wife once already, will hardly wish to be so deceived again. He need only be shown. A seed here, a whisper there, a wedge, Percival, driven patiently. A marriage with a wedge in it bears no son, and a duke with no son is only a clock running down toward us. For this was the whole of their design, mother and son, not to stop the wedding, that could not now be done, but to poison it in the cradle, to catch the bride in one greedy glance, and carry it to the groom, and to widen, by every patient means, the crack they were certain must exist between a cold rich man and the poor woman who had married him for his money. They did not know, how could they, that the bride they meant to expose had already spent an hour exposing herself completely, with no notion she was watched, and had been found not wanting but luminous. They did not know the Duke was at that moment a mile off in a borrowed coat, with his dead father's watch warming in his hand, and his careful fortress quietly falling, stone by stone, into a frost-bright lane. They knew only that it was past noon, and the bride had not come, and the bridegroom was nowhere to be found, and the chapel was very cold. "Where," said Lady Augusta, to no one, the glove smile slipping for just a moment, "is my nephew?" The smith had been quick, and the mare was sound, and they came up the long drive to Hartmoor at last under a sky that had begun, faintly, to clear. The house was vast, grey stone and 100 windows and a chapel set a little apart among bare trees, and Eleanor looked at it and felt the old dread try to return, and found, to her surprise, that it could not get a purchase. Something had changed on the road. She did not entirely understand what. She knew only that she was no longer riding toward a stranger with the resignation of a woman going to be filed away on a shelf. She was, against every instinct she had spent 4 years cultivating, curious, and beneath the curiosity, alarmingly, something that felt almost like gladness, and had no business being there at all, and was attached, she realized with a small cold shock, not to the house or the title, but to a silent man in a grey coat, who had asked her whether his Duke had forgotten the way back to his own heart. The coachman drew up at the chapel steps. He did not, this time, stay on the box. He came down. He set the brake. He opened the door and let down the step himself, and held out his hand to her. And Eleanor, who had not waited to be helped down from anything in years, looked at the offered hand, and then at the grey eyes above it, and put her cold fingers into his palm, and let him hand her down onto the gravel of Hartmoor. "Thank you," she said, "for the road. You have made it a great deal less frightening than I had any right to expect. I hope your Duke knows what he has in you." Something moved across the coachman's face, the almost smile of a man who had not properly smiled in a very long time, and had half forgotten the shape of it. "Miss Wren," he said, "before you go in, there is something I must tell you, and I find I would rather tell it here, between the two of us, than let you learn it in there, among strangers." Eleanor went still. "You are frightening me. I do not mean to. I find I would do a great deal now to never frighten you again." He took off the low hat. He set it on the box, and he straightened, and the worn grey coat could not hide it any longer. The way he stood, the way he held his head, the unservant-like directness of him that she had noticed and dismissed all morning. "I told you no lies on the road. I want you to hold to that, whatever you feel in the next moment. Every word I spoke to you was true, but I let you believe a thing that was not true, and for that I will answer to you however you wish, and for as long as you wish." The chapel doors had opened. People were spilling out onto the steps. A hard-faced older woman in a great deal of lace, a soft, damp young man, a knot of staring, avid county faces, and behind them came an old butler whose composed expression did not so much as flicker as he descended the steps, and bowed, deeply, unmistakably, not to the lace, not to the crowd, but to the man in the coachman's coat. "Welcome home, Your Grace," said Mr. Finch. 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 The word went through the gathering, like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor did not move. She stood on the gravel of Hartmoor in her dove-grey gown with her small bag in her hand, 2 handkerchiefs, her mother's prayer book, a sprig of rosemary for remembrance, and she looked at the man she had spoken to as a servant for 1 whole honest hour, and understood, all at once and completely, exactly what she had done. Every word, her brother, her fear, her mother's pearls. The clock one is afraid to wind. The corner of a life she had been ready to make her home, the lot of it, poured out to a stranger on a box, who had been no stranger and no servant at all, but the very man it could ruin her, to have been so naked in front of. "You," she said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised even her. "You are the Duke of Hartmoor." "I am," Julian said. "You drove me an hour," she said slowly, "in a dead man's coat, to hear me speak of you, while I believed you could not hear. I did. Why?" And now there was something under the steadiness, something hot and bright and dangerous. "Why would you do such a thing to a woman who had already given you everything you asked? I signed your contract. I came 2 days north alone. What more did you need that you had to steal it from me on a road?" Julian did not look away from her. On the steps his aunt had gone the color of tallow. The watching faces had forgotten to whisper, but he looked at none of them. He looked only at the woman in grey. "Because I was deceived once," he said, "by a beautiful woman who said all the right things in all the right rooms, and I swore I would never again walk blind into a bargain that could cost me everything I am. I came to your road meaning to catch a schemer, Miss Wren. I am a suspicious man, and I have made my suspicion into a fortress, and lived in it alone, and I am not proud of it." His voice dropped. and the whole cold morning seemed to lean in to hear it. And instead, I found a woman who spoke of my fairness when she thought it could win her nothing, and of her own fear when it could only cost her, and who stopped on a freezing road to tell a servant he ought to mend his broken watch, and let the dead let him go on living. I did not find what I came to find. I found something I had stopped believing existed, and stopped looking for, because looking and not finding is the more painful thing. I am ashamed of the manner of the finding. I am not ashamed of what I found, and I would not give it back for my life. Eleanor's eyes were very bright. You might simply have met me, she said. Like an honest man, you might have come to the Heart's Head and said, I am the Duke. Let us take each other's measure. I would have told you the same things. I have no other things to tell. Yes, Julian said, I might. It is the great regret of the morning, and I expect it will be the great regret of a good many mornings after, that I did not. I have spent 4 years learning to trust nothing and no one, and I have just discovered, far too late and in front of far too many people, that I would have trusted you on sight. That is my failure, Eleanor Wren, not yours. You have done nothing this morning but be exactly, relentlessly yourself, in front of a man you thought could not matter, and it undid me. It was then that Lady Augusta Vane recovered her voice, because women like Lady Augusta always recover their voices, and there is nothing they recover them for but mischief. Julian, she said, sweeping down a step, all wounded concern, one hand pressed to her lace bosom. Dearest, you cannot mean to go through with this, not now, not after such a display. A creature off a hired coach, who by your own account has spent the morning calculating roofs and settlements and precisely how much cold she will endure for your money. We have all heard you say it, girl, though no one had heard, for no one had been on that road but the two of them, a grasping, scheming, desperate little madam. Julian did not raise his voice. He had never, in his life, needed to. The single word fell across his aunt's, like the flat of a blade laid against a throat, and she stopped. You will not finish that sentence, he said, about the only person on these steps who has told me the truth today. He turned the cracked watch once in his fingers, the watch Eleanor had handed back to him in the frost, and looked at his aunt, and at his cousin behind her, with eyes that had gone from gray to something colder and clearer than ice. We will speak again, you and I and Percival, about a great many things. About letters and whispers and the very tender concern you have shown these 14 months for a happiness you would inherit the whole of England to be rid of. But not today. Today I am to be married, if the lady will still have me, and I find I do not want your faces in the room while I ask her. Lady Augusta's mouth opened and shut. Percival made a small wet sound. But the Duke of Hartmoor had already turned his back on the lot of them, on the lace and the whispers and the avid staring faces, and gone down on the gravel to the woman in gray, not quite kneeling, but inclined toward her, the whole of a tall, proud man, bending toward someone for the first time in longer than he could remember, and he held out his hand, not a command this time, a question. Eleanor Wren, he said, and her name in his mouth was a careful, unfamiliar, precious thing, like a man handling glass. Hear me, and then choose freely, for I will hold you to nothing. The debts are paid already. That was done the day you signed, and it stands whatever you decide this minute, so let there be no weight of it on your choosing. Your brother will have his London physician, and his sea air, and every chance that money can buy him, and that is done too, and written so it cannot be undone, exactly as you asked, and it asks nothing of you in return. You may turn from me on this gravel, and go home to Henry a free woman, with all of it kept, and I will think you wise. His voice was not quite steady. I have nothing left to offer you but the truth, which I have managed very badly this morning, and a cold house I do not know how to warm, and a man inside a duke who had forgotten he was in there until an hour ago, on a frozen road. I deceived you to learn what you were. Now you know what I am. A suspicious, guarded, lonely man who drove an hour in a dead man's coat rather than risk his heart in the open like an honest one. That is the worst of me, and you have met it before noon on your wedding day, which is more than most brides are granted. Knowing it, will you have me anyway? The morning held its breath. Even the wind seemed to wait. Eleanor looked at the offered hand. She looked at the cracked watch he still held in the other. The watch stopped at the hour his father died. She looked at the gray eyes that had been a servant's an hour ago, and were now, unmistakably and entirely, only a frightened man's. "You are quite right that I can endure cold," she said at last. "I told you so on the road. Before I knew it was you I was telling. What I cannot endure is being deceived." She let him feel the full weight of it. "And you deceived me, Your Grace, on the morning of our wedding. Whatever your reasons, however the finding moved you, it was a coward's road to an honest place, and we will both of us know that for the rest of our lives. It is a poor beginning." "It is," he agreed, very low. "The poorest. I will not pretend otherwise to spare myself." "So here is my condition," Eleanor said, "and it is the only one I shall ever make you, and I will make it once, never again, not the smallest thing. You may be cold with me, and silent with me, and you may take a year of winters, or 10, to find the way back to wherever you have hidden your heart. I will wait out the winters. I have waited out worse, in thinner coats. But you will never again let me speak into a silence believing I am alone in it. If there is a thing I ought to know, you will tell me, though it shames you, though it costs you, though you would sooner drive an hour in every coachman's coat in England than say it to my face. Honesty, or nothing. Give me that, and you may keep all your cold. I will find the corners of you, and I will be content. I will marry the man, not the title, and I will mend your wretched watch myself, since you plainly never will." And the Duke of Hartmoor, who had not wept since he was a boy, who had built a fortress and lived in it alone, with a stopped watch in his pocket, laughed instead, a single rough, astonished breath of a laugh, the sound of something breaking open that had been nailed shut a very long time. "That," he said, "I can give you. That I will give you gladly, every honest cold day, for the rest of my life. You may have the watch as well. God knows I have not been able to do anything with it but carry it." She put her hand in his. "Then yes," said Eleanor Wren, on the gravel of Hartmoor, in front of every staring face. "I still mean to say yes. But I warn you, Your Grace, I am a great deal more trouble than a quiet woman in grey appears. You have only met the half of me that survives. You have not yet met the half that intends to live. I find," said Julian, closing his hand around hers, "that I should like to meet her more than I have ever wanted anything." And a little way off on the steps, unnoticed by the bride and groom but not by Mr. Finch, who noticed everything, Lady Augusta Vane watched the cold Duke of Hartmoor look at his plain little bride, as though she had hung the morning, and understood that the wedge would not drive itself between these two with a single greedy glance, and began, behind her glove smile, to plan something a great deal worse. They were married within the hour, in the cold, bright chapel, with the county's tongues already traveling faster than any carriage, and Lady Augusta and her son seated stiff and smiling in the second pew, because to leave would have been to surrender the field, and Lady Augusta never surrendered a field she meant to burn later. Eleanor said her vows in a clear, steady voice. Julian said his low, and when he slid the ring onto her finger, not the great ducal band with its crest, which had sat on a colder hand once, and which he had left in its box, but a plain gold ring that had been his mother's. His hand was not entirely steady, and Eleanor felt that small tremor, and understood it for the enormous thing it was, and pressed his fingers once, the way she had pressed her father's, to tell him she had felt it, and would say nothing. The wedding breakfast was small and strange and, by the end, very nearly merry, in the way of meals where two people keep catching one another's eye and looking away. Old Crane, recovered from his diplomatic chill with miraculous speed, sent word up that the mayor's new shoe was holding, and that he had taken the liberty of giving the wedding team an extra measure of oats, Your Grace, the day being what it was. Mr. Finch poured the good wine, and permitted himself, when he was certain no one was watching, the precise eighth of an inch of a smile. And then it was over, and the guests were gone, and the new Duchess of Hartmoor was alone in a fortress of dark stone, with a husband she had known for the length of one road. Blackwood, the house was called. Hartmoor was the dukedom, Blackwood the great seat at the heart of it. And it was magnificent, and it was not welcoming. It had been built to keep weather out, and had learned, over the cold years, to keep warmth out too. The first dinner was a trial. A table so long the footman seemed to serve two separate meals at its distant ends. The crystal glittering, the silver gleaming, the silence immense. Eleanor looked down the shining length of it at her husband, a remote, handsome stranger at the far shore, and thought, "What have I done?" He looked up as though he had heard her. "Is the meal to your liking, Your Grace?" he asked, and the formality of it, Your Grace, to her, who had been Eleanor on the gravel, fell between them like a dropped tray. "It is excellent, thank you," she said. "But you are very far away. and you promised me honesty, so I will be honest. I cannot court a man at 30 feet. If we are to be cold together, husband, let us at least be cold within speaking distance. It is more economical with candles." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Then we shall have the table altered," he said. And the next night, the vast middle leaves of it were gone, and they sat near enough to pass the salt, and that was the first small warmth let into Blackwood. And it was Eleanor who had opened the window. It was not the last. She did not try to change him. She had told the coachman she was good at corners, and she was, but she changed the spaces around him, quietly, patiently, the way water changes stone. She rose early, dressed herself in one of her plain Renfield gowns rather than wait to be attended like an ornament, and went down to the kitchens, where the staff stared at the new Duchess in stunned silence, until she said, "Good morning. I am Eleanor. I should like to learn this house from the bottom up, if you will teach me, for I cannot love a place I do not understand, and I should very much like to love it." Mrs. Hale, the formidable housekeeper who had served the cold Hartmoor dukes for 30 years, looked into the new Duchess's face for artifice, and found none, and something in her own iron softened by a degree. "As you wish, your grace," she said. And so began Eleanor's quiet conquest of Blackwood. She learned the servants' names and their troubles, inspected the larders and the still room, found the great 2-story library coated in the dust of a stopped house, and spent her afternoons there, opening the heavy curtains, letting in the thin north light, dusting the spines, waking a heart that had not beaten in years. Julian watched her. He did not speak of it, but he watched. He came in from his long rides and his longer hours over the ledgers in his study, and found small changes waiting for him like quiet gifts left by someone who did not stay to be thanked. A bowl of the last roses on a hall table, the smell of beeswax where there had been only dust and cold iron, the sound, somewhere in the house, of a person singing under her breath while she worked. The fortress, which he had built so carefully to keep everything out, was being made habitable from the inside by someone who had simply walked in through the only door he had forgotten to guard, the one marked kindness, which he had assumed no one would ever bother to try. He began to seek her out. He told himself it was to discuss the estate. It was not. He would find her in the library at dusk, mending a household linen by the fire. Her hands were never idle, and he would mean to stay a moment and stay an hour, and they would talk, not of anything that mattered, of the weather, and a horse that had cast a shoe and a passage in a book, and the not mattering of it was the most restful thing he had known in a decade. And then, one evening, it began to matter. She brought him tea in his study, late, because the light under his door had been burning long past the hour any man should be at his accounts. He was hunched over a great ledger, the candlelight throwing his sharp features into stark relief, and he looked up, startled, when she set the cup at his elbow. "You need not do that," he said. "There are servants." "I know," Eleanor said, "but the servants are not your wife." The word hung in the room. He looked at her, truly looked, the way he had on the frozen road, and something in his careful face came loose. "Walk with me," he said. "It is cold, and the garden is black as pitch, and I find I cannot say what I must say to you, in a room with a roof on it. I have spent too long saying nothing in rooms with roofs." They went out into the formal garden of Blackwood, where the box hedges stood black against the last gray light, and the air smelled of frost and old leaves, and they walked the gravel paths, and the Duke told his wife the truth, all of it, this time, with no coat between them and no disguise, and every honest thing she said, he could answer with his own name. He told her of his father, the 5th Duke, a man of grand appetites and ruinous investments who had loved his son in a careless, thunderous way, and left him, at 26, a title, 1,000 dependent tenants, and a mountain of debt with the rot already in it. He told her of the watch, how it had been his father's, how the old man had pressed it into his hand in the last hour, and the hands had stopped, by some trick of chance or grief, at the very minute the breath went out of him, and how Julian had carried it ever since, and never once been able to wind it, because winding it had felt like agreeing his father was truly gone. Grief is a clock we are afraid to wind. He had heard his own buried heart in her mother's words, on a road, from a stranger he had been deceiving, and it had nearly stopped him in the traces, and he told her of Cassandra, of the beautiful, brilliant girl he had married at 28, half in love and wholly in hope, and how she had wanted the coronet and the envy, and not the tired, careful man who came with them, how she had discovered the estate was fighting for its life and felt cheated of her bargain, how she had punished him for it, coldly and cleverly, For 3 winters, the closed doors, the public slights, the lovers chosen for how much they would wound, until the fever took her, and he had stood at her grave feeling chiefly, to his lasting shame, relief, and had decided in that churchyard that he would never again hand his heart to a person and wait to see what they did with it. So I built the fortress, he said, and I have lived in it, and I told myself I was at peace, and I was not at peace. I was only unbothered. There is a difference, as a wise woman once told me about a different cold thing. And then my man of business found me a ruined family with a marriageable daughter, and I thought, here is a transaction with no hope in it to be disappointed. A wife who wants my money is at least honest about wanting it. I can survive a wife who wants my money. I have already survived a wife who wanted my name. He stopped on the dark path and turned to her. And then you spoke of your brother's cricket ball, Eleanor, and your mother's pearls, and you gave a deceiving stranger back his broken watch, and told him to let the dead let him live. And you ruined the entire careful arrangement of my life, and I have never been so grateful to anyone for anything. Eleanor had listened the way she had listened on the road, without interrupting, without platitudes, without the small, useless noises people make to fill another's pain. When he was done, she did not tell him it was all right, because it had not been all right, and she was not a woman who said things she did not mean. She was a fool, Eleanor said at last, quietly. You're Cassandra, not for failing to love you. Love cannot be commanded, and I will never blame a woman for the absence of it, but for holding a whole living man in her hand and seeing only the title he came wrapped in. That is the great poverty, Julian, to be given a person and to keep only the parcelling. She looked up at him in the dark. I have been poor in money the whole of my adult life, and I tell you, it is nothing, nothing, beside that kind of poverty. I should rather have your honest cold than another man's warm lie. I told you that before I knew your face. I tell you again now that I know it. He reached out, slowly, as a man reaches toward something he is half afraid will vanish, and touched her cheek with cold fingers. You are not in a corner of my life, Eleanor, he said. I heard you say it, on the road, that you were good at corners, that you would make a life out of the edges of mine. I have thought of nothing else for a fortnight. His voice was rough. You are not in the corner. You walked into the middle of a house I had emptied on purpose, and you lit the lamps, and I find the middle is exactly where I want you, and I do not know the first thing about how to deserve it. You wind the watch, Eleanor said softly. That is how you begin, one turn at a time. The deserving comes after, with the days. They stood a long time in the black garden, close, not speaking, 2 people who had each been certain the world had stopped having surprises in it for them, and had each, on the same frost-bright road, been proved wrong. And in the days that followed, the cold house went on warming. Letters flew south. The London physician was at Renfield within the week, and his reports, when they came, were cautious, and then, slowly, hopeful. Henry was rallying. The sea air was advised. Sir Mortimer wrote to his daughter a single shaking line. He is laughing again, Elle. Your brother is laughing again, and Eleanor read it by the library fire, and wept at last, freely, the tears she had refused herself for 4 years, and Julian found her, and did not tell her to stop, but sat beside her, and held her hand, and let the clock run. Let's pause here, just for a breath. If Eleanor and Julian have found their way into your heart the way they found their way into each other's, do this small thing for me before we go on. Tap subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from tonight. It truly helps the channel more than you know, and I love picturing all the different places this story is being heard, from kitchens and long drives to dark bedrooms at the end of a hard day. Now, settle back in, because the cruel and the clever do not give up so easily as all that, and Lady Augusta Vane has spent the whole of the winter planning her revenge. The season is coming, and with it, the ball. The move to London for the season was Julian's decision, and he made it grimly, for he hated the city. But appearances had to be maintained. The Tun could not be allowed to suspect that the Duke of Hartmoor was fighting for the life of his estate, for a fortune is half real money and half the world's belief in it, and the moment the world stopped believing, the creditors would come like crows. So they opened the great gilt and mirror townhouse in Grosvenor Square, and Eleanor, who had never in her life seen so many candles burning at once, for no reason but to be seen burning, met the whispering, judging, fan-fluttering world of London society with the same quiet dignity she had brought to the Blackwood kitchens, and was neither cowed by it nor courting it. The ton was agog. The recluse Duke had married, and married down, married a plain nobody, a country mouse who somehow had trapped the lion. They stared at her in her simple, elegant, unjeweled gowns, and waited for her to put a foot wrong, and she did not, because she was not performing for them, and so could not be caught out of character. And then Lady Augusta came to call. She arrived one gray afternoon, unannounced, sweeping into the drawing room in a froth of fashion, with Percival damp and smiling at her heel, all warmth and family feeling. "My dear Duchess," she cried, taking Eleanor's hands, "we could not stay away a day longer. We have been so anxious to see how you are getting on." Thrown into all this, a glance, faintly pitying, around the gilded room, from such very humble beginnings. It must be quite overwhelming. One does worry. Eleanor, who had been warned by her husband, and had taken her own measure of the woman on the chapel steps, poured the tea herself, and was perfectly pleasant. "You are kind to worry, Lady Augusta. I find I manage." The campaign began as such campaigns do, obliquely. Lady Augusta let her eyes travel, slow and admiring, and pointed, over the silver tea service, the gilt mirrors, the Aubusson carpet. "All quite splendid, is it not? My nephew has wonderful things." "Wonderful. Do you know," she leaned in, confiding, "the Hartmoor diamonds are reckoned the finest in 3 counties. The Perrior alone is worth a gentleman's whole estate. They are kept at Blackwood, in the strong room. But as Duchess, of course, they are yours now for life." Percival had begun, very quietly, to back toward a doorway. "You will both call upon my solicitors on Monday," Julian said, in the tone of a man closing a ledger. "We will discuss restitution, and the alternative to it, which involves a magistrate and a great deal less of this comfortable society than you are accustomed to. Tonight, however," he turned his back on them, deliberately, completely. "The cut is clean and final as a blade. Tonight, you may simply leave. You are spoiling my wife's first ball, and I find I will not have it." It was, the ton agreed for years afterward, the most thoroughly any 2 people had ever been ruined between one waltz and the next. And then it was Lady Marle who broke the spell, rapping her cane hard upon the floor in the ringing quiet. "Well," she announced, to the whole gawping room, with enormous satisfaction. "That is that then. The serpents are leaving, and the music has stopped, which is intolerable. Strike up a waltz at once. The Duke and Duchess of Hartmoor wish to dance, and I wish to watch them do it, and I am far too old to be kept waiting." The music swelled, and Julian turned to Eleanor, and drew her back into the center of the floor, into the circle of his arms, and the staring, whispering world fell away, as it had fallen away on their wedding day, leaving only the 2 of them. "For one moment," Eleanor said quietly, as they turned, "I thought you believed her." "I know," he said, and his voice was rough with the shame of it. "I saw it in your face, and it will haunt me. That was the last of the old fortress, Eleanor, the part of me that flinches first and trusts after. I felt it move, and I hated it, and it will never move again where you are concerned. I swear it to you, on the watch and on my father's grave." "I was not doubting you. I was deciding how slowly to destroy them." "I did not doubt that for very long," she admitted, and laid her head against his shoulder, there in front of everyone, which a duchess was not at all supposed to do. "You are a great deal of trouble, you know. You always were, from the very first mile." "I know," Julian said, and held her closer, and the cold Duke of Hartmoor smiled, openly, helplessly, the whole of it reaching his eyes, in front of the entire astonished ton, who would talk of nothing else for a fortnight. They did not stay long in London after that. There was no need. The season had done its single useful thing, which was to show the world a marriage so plainly, scandalously happy that no creditor would ever again doubt the strength of the house behind it. Lady Augusta and her son retreated from society to settle their debt to the estate, and were not, for a very long while, received anywhere that mattered. The lieutenant sold out of his regiment and went abroad, where, one hopes, he learned a cheaper trade than lying. And the Duke and Duchess of Hartmoor went home to Blackwood, to the cold house that was no longer cold, to begin the unglamorous and unending work of a real life. It was on the morning after their return that Eleanor gave Julian his wedding gift, 4 months late. She had taken the watch, stolen it really, from the drawer where he kept it, weeks before, and carried it quietly to the finest clockmaker in York, an old man with steady hands, and asked him not to hide the crack but to honor it, to mend the broken face with a fine seam of gold, run along the very line of the break, so that the wound itself became the most beautiful thing about it, a vein of light where the breaking had been. and to make it run again. She put it in his hand at the breakfast table without ceremony, the way he had once driven her an hour without ceremony, and watched his face. Julian turned it over. He saw the gold seam catching the morning light along the old crack. He heard, felt, really, in his palm, the small, steady ticking of a thing that had been stopped for 7 years. The hands moved. It was 20 minutes past 4 no longer. It was 8:45 on an ordinary, extraordinary morning, and it was keeping time. "You said you would mend it yourself," he said, when he could speak. "On the gravel. I thought it a figure of speech." "I am very rarely speaking figuratively," Eleanor said. "It is one of my chief faults. I told you the dead would rather be carried than stopped, Julian. Now you may carry your father in a watch that runs. And the crack is still there, you see? It will always be there. I did not let him take it away. Only now the breaking is what makes it beautiful. That is all grief is meant to become, in the end, if we are brave enough to let it. Not hidden, not forgotten, mended, with a thread of gold, and wound again every morning." And the Duke of Hartmoor, who had not wept since he was a boy, put his face in his hands at his own breakfast table and wept at last, not for grief, this time, but for the strange, unbearable mercy of being, after so many cold years, completely seen. And his wife came round the table and held him while he did not tell him to stop and let the clock run. 1 year on, the autumn came again to Hartmoor, and it came not as a creditor, but as a friend. The great house was not cold any longer, not in the rooms where Eleanor had been, which was by now all of them. There were late roses on the hall tables and the smell of beeswax where there had been dust. The long dining table stayed in its shortened form, and the library curtains stood open to the thin gold light, and somewhere in the house, most hours of the day, a person was singing under her breath while she worked. The servants moved differently. The whole house breathed. The Tyndale mine had not been lost after all. It had flooded again that spring, and the cost of the new pumps would have finished a lesser estate. But it was Eleanor, with her practical mind and her long education in making much from little, who had spent a fortnight bent over the old estate maps beside her husband, and found, in a surveyor's notebook from the last century, a forgotten drainage adit that had only to be cleared and reopened, at a fraction of the cost. My clever practical Duchess, Julian had called her. The tenants, less restrained, called her a miracle, and named a new cottage row after her, which embarrassed her enormously. Renfield had been let go at last, with no grief. The Wrens had no further use for a damp ruin in the south. Sir Mortimer had taken a snug, solvent little house near enough to Blackwood to dine there twice a week, and had got his old broad laugh back along with his solvency. And Henry Wren, who had thrown a cricket ball clean over the south lawn the week before and broken a library window doing it, and been forgiven instantly by his brother-in-law and scolded thoroughly by his sister. Henry was 17 now, and brown, and loud, and gloriously, riotously well. The cough was a memory, and a quiet one. He had kept his promise. He had got better chiefly, he insisted, in order to come north and be a great nuisance to the Duke, and he discharged the duty daily, and the Duke bore it with a patience that fooled absolutely no one. Eleanor sat by the library fire with a small, dark-haired, gravely staring infant asleep in the crook of her arm, a boy with his father's stormy gray eyes, who had been christened for the old 5th Duke, so that the name might at last belong to someone gentle, and she watched her husband cross the room toward her, the Duke of Hartmoor, who smiled now easily, the way a man smiles who has remembered the way back to where he put his heart and found, to his astonishment, that someone had been keeping the fire lit. On the mantel above her, in a small stand where the morning light caught it, a gold pocket watch kept time, its old crack a vein of gold, its hands moving, ticking quietly through the warm gold evening of a house that had, at long last, learned to keep its own. Eleanor had wound it that morning, as she wound it every morning. It was the first thing she did, before the fires were lit, before the household woke. She took the watch from its stand, and gave it its single turn, and listened to it catch and run, and thought of a stranger in a gray coat on a frozen road, and was glad. "What are you thinking?" Julian asked, settling beside her, his shoulder warm against hers, one finger gentle against the sleeping baby's curled fist. "I am thinking," Eleanor said, "of a woman in a gray gown in a hired carriage, telling all her secrets to the back of a coachman's coat, and being quite certain the world had stopped having any surprises left in it for her. And had it? It had not," she said. "It had only been waiting, all that while, for me to stop expecting them." She turned her head and looked at him, this guarded, difficult, honest man, who had deceived her once, and never once since, who had bent the whole of himself toward her, on a gravel drive, in front of the world, and never straightened again. You were a coward on a road that first morning, and then you were braver, in a ballroom and at a breakfast table, than any honest man I ever knew. I think that is the truest thing about people in the end, not whether they begin brave, whether they learn it. I had a good teacher, Julian said, and kissed her temple, and rested his cheek against her hair, with the deep ease of a man who has arrived, after a long cold journey, exactly where he was always meant to be. I am only grateful you knew horses, and stopped for a broken watch, and were not, in the end, the woman my aunt so desperately needed you to be. The fire burned steady. The child slept on, and on the mantel the mended watch kept time, not against the dead now, but for the living, marking out, tick by golden tick, the quiet ordinary hours of two people who had each been certain they would live the whole of their lives in a corner, and had instead, against all expectation, found the middle of the room, and each other, and the lamp lit. Dear listener, wherever you are tonight, however cold the road behind you has been, I hope Eleanor's story stays with you a little while after the fire has burned down, because this was never really a tale about a duke, or a fortune, or a great gray house. It was about the quiet courage of telling the truth when you are certain no one is listening, and the strange grace of discovering that someone was, and loved you the more for it. It was about being afraid to wind the clock, and winding it anyway. About a wound mended not by hiding the crack, but by running a thread of gold along it, until the breaking becomes the most beautiful part. About being, after so very long unseen, finally and completely seen, and staying, once you are. May you have someone who listens to you the way Julian listened on that road. And if you do not yet, may you keep speaking the truth all the same, plainly and without fear, until the world remembers how to surprise you. It is still capable of it. It is only waiting, I think, for us to stop expecting that it isn't. So sleep well tonight. Wind your clock in the morning. Carry your dead gently, and let yourself go on. And remember that the quiet, overlooked, useful people of this world, the ones who know where the spare key is kept, who sit in the gray at the edge of the room, are so very often the ones with the most love to give, and the longest to wait, and the truest hearts of all. If this story moved you, leave a like, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments which moment was your favorite: the road, the reveal, the ballroom, or the thread of gold. Thank you, truly, for spending this hour with me at Hartmoor. Until the next story, good night.